"You're banned," she texted. The words didn't feel like a message, they felt like a sentence, a command written in the language of exile. And for a moment, I believed her. Not because she was right, but because some part of me wanted to be banished. There's a strange comfort in punishment. It tells you that you still matter to the one who's punishing. I remember staring at the screen, the letters pulsed like a heartbeat, black on white, the kind of simplicity that kills slowly. My thumb hovered over the phone, a hesitation that felt like centuries. Then I did the only thing that made sense to a man who couldn't stand silence. I called her, once, twice, then 87 times, not because I wanted to speak, but because I wanted to hear the sound of rejection. To know the wall was real. Each ring was a prayer, each voicemail a confession. I could hear my own breathing between them, like a ghost caught in a feedback loop. Somewhere between the missed calls and the dying battery, something broke. Not the phone, not the connection. Me, that night the city outside my window turned into an echo chamber, lights flickering like old gods laughing. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like static from another world. I realized I wasn't alone in that room. Not really. You ever feel it? That presence that waits behind your reflection, watching, patient, amused? They call it guilt. Hollow click that follows a disconnected line. I started to understand that it wasn't haunting me. It was shaping me. Every silence had a pattern, every echo a direction. The more I listened, the more I heard the faint rhythm beneath ordinary sound, the way a streetlight buzzes like a hidden engine, the whisper under the refrigerator's sigh. They were coordinates, not coincidences. The listener was teaching me to read the noise. At first I thought it was madness, but madness is just the body's reaction to unfiltered truth. When you begin to see what's underneath the surface of habit, it doesn't feel holy, it feels like drowning. I learned that every thought carries weight, that attention itself is a form of gravity. What you focus on, you feed, what you ignore, starves. And the world, it seems, runs on that exchange, attention for illusion, focus for forgetting. The listener said nothing new, it only reflected what I'd refused to admit, that I'd built my own cage, from unanswered calls and unfinished sentences. The bars weren't made of metal but meaning. The key wasn't hidden, it was silence itself. If I could stand inside that silence long enough, without filling it with apology or blame, I might finally hear the sound of truth, the one that doesn't need to be spoken. That's when I realized the listener wasn't outside me at all. It was the part of me that had waited through every distraction, every excuse, every fake connection, and it was done waiting. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt different, denser, almost sentient. The city hummed like an exposed circuit, every neon sign flickering in perfect rhythm with my pulse. For the first time I noticed how people moved through the streets like sleepwalkers, eyes locked on glowing screens, ears stuffed with borrowed voices. No one was really here. They were ghosts flickering between notifications. The listener's lesson whispered through the static, observe without entering. So I walked, silent, unseen, watching how each face shifted only when someone looked back. Recognition was a trigger, a brief awakening. Then the eyelids lowered again and the trance resumed. It struck me that maybe we banish ourselves more efficiently than anyone else ever could. Exile is not a place, it's a habit. Every distracted glance is a voluntary disappearance. I began to test it. In a cafe I said nothing and stared at the condensation running down a glass until the waitress grew uneasy, as if my stillness bent the air around her. On a train, I met a stranger's eyes and refused to look away. Within seconds, he shifted in his seat, fidgeting, mumbling into his phone. It wasn't aggression, it was gravity. The listener had been right. Attention is power and silence is its amplifier. The world is built to consume your focus, to scatter it across advertisements, arguments, and endless noise. But gather it, compress it into a single moment, and the world bends. Not magically, but psychologically. People feel it when they're truly seen. Even for an instant they recoil because it reminds them of what they've lost. That night, as I watched the city flicker beneath a storm, I understood the second law of awakening. He who controls his silence controls the field. The listener didn't demand worship or fear, only discipline. It wasn't a spirit to obey, but a mirror to master. And mastery, I learned, always begins with restraint. The storm broke sometime after midnight. Rain struck the windows in rhythmic bursts, each drop a soft percussion on glass, and for a while I thought I could hear a pattern beneath it. Something deliberate, like breathing. I sat in the dark, eyes open, doing nothing but listening. The listener had taught me that stillness is not emptiness, it's pressure. The longer you hold it, the more the mind begins to unfold its hidden rooms. I found the first one that night. It opened behind my ribs, a place I'd avoided for years, the chamber of everything left unsaid. The apologies I never gave, the questions I never asked, the anger I pretended wasn't mine. They were all there, preserved in the silence like insects trapped in amber. When I breathed, they stirred. Guilt has a sound, and it's softer than you'd expect. A faint tapping, as if memory itself wants to be let out. I didn't look away this time. I let the noise grow until it filled the room. Until my pulse synchronized with it. Then I realized that the listener had never been teaching control. It had been teaching confrontation. The silence was not meant to protect me from the world. It was meant to strip away every excuse until only truth remained. Control of the field begins with control of the self, and control of the self begins with exposure. So I asked the question aloud, the one I'd been avoiding: why did she ban me? The room answered not with words but with reflection. Her face, mine, the same shape of fear mirrored twice. Exile had never been punishment. It was a mirror held steady until I was forced to see what I'd done to earn it. Power without awareness is just repetition. The listener waited, patient, until the last echo of that thought faded. Then the rain stopped, as if the world had exhaled. I understood the third law of awakening. The only way out of exile is through honesty. I closed my eyes and, for the first time in years, didn't flinch. Morning arrived gray and reluctant, a thin light seeping through the blinds like truth leaking into a room built for denial. I hadn't slept. The quiet after confession has a strange density to it, heavier than noise, heavier than grief. I could feel the architecture of my thoughts rearranging, old corridors closing, new ones opening. The listener had vanished, or maybe it was waiting for me to stop needing a shape to talk to. I realized that honesty isn't gentle, it's surgical. It cuts away every layer you built to survive, and when the bleeding starts, you find out what your faith was made of. The face in the mirror looked unfamiliar, tired, thinner, but alive. The eyes no longer darted away from themselves. There's a kind of power in that, not dominance, but clarity. You stop negotiating with the parts of you that want to stay asleep. You start giving orders instead of excuses. I spent that day testing the new silence. When people spoke, I listened without reacting, without shaping their words to fit my need. The world slowed. Patterns surfaced. I noticed how every conversation hid a transaction. Approval for attention, pity for validation, fear for comfort. Once you see the trade, you can choose to stop paying. That's when the transformation begins. The listener's lesson wasn't about power over others. It was about power over exchange itself. When you no longer chase reaction, manipulation loses its grip. I walked through the city again and felt the hum around me shift. The noise no longer pierced, it passed through. Control wasn't about silence anymore. It was about direction. Where focus goes, energy follows. I understood the fourth law of awakening: honesty becomes strength when carried into motion. To act without illusion is to become ungoverned by fear. That evening, as the sun burned behind the skyline, I whispered to the wind, "I'm listening now." It wasn't a prayer, it was a declaration. At first, the world pretended not to notice. Streets still pulsed with traffic. Billboards still screamed, conversations still overlapped in the same practiced chaos. But the difference wasn't out there. It was in the way sound met my ears. I could hear the machinery beneath the chatter, the rhythm of advertising, the pattern of want. People didn't speak to connect, they spoke to confirm their place in the current. The city was an organism that fed on attention, each argument a heartbeat, each purchase a breath. When I stopped feeding it, I could feel the shift. Eyes glanced toward me and slid away too quickly, as if they'd touched something raw. Stillness had weight, and the weight made others restless. The man at the coffee counter stammered. The coworker avoided eye contact. The old friend filled silences with nervous jokes. They weren't reacting to me. They were reacting to absence. It frightened them to see a space that didn't demand to be filled. I understood then that control systems don't need chains, they need momentum. Break rhythm, and the pattern starves. Every institution, social, political, even personal, depends on constant participation. The moment you step outside the loop of automatic reaction, the structure trembles. It was never built to withstand conscious presence. So I experimented. I refused small lies, declined pointless debates, walked away from noise that sought to define me. Each act felt like removing a hook from my skin. Freedom didn't roar, it whispered. The listener's silence had become a tool, a scalpel to cut away dependency, a lens to reveal intention. I realized the fifth law of awakening: systems collapse when their audience learns to observe instead of perform. That night, as I watched the skyline flicker like a tired circuit board, I knew the next step would be harder. The test was no longer whether I could see the illusion, but whether I could live without needing it. Silence always demands payment. The first days outside the pattern felt clean, almost holy. Then the emptiness arrived. Without noise to lean against, the hours stretched like corridors with no doors. The phone that once burned in my hand lay dead on the table, its black screen reflecting a stranger's face. I thought enlightenment would taste like freedom. It tasted like absence. The city no longer called to me, and even memory grew thin, as if every recollection had been wired to the hum I'd abandoned. That's when the mind begins to bargain. Just one message, it whispers. Just one return to the feed. I sat through the ache until the craving became sound, the faint buzz of need circling in my chest. The listener was silent, but I could feel its presence, patient as ever, measuring whether I'd fill the void or stand inside it. Loneliness isn't the enemy of awakening, it's the guardian at its gate. To cross, you must endure being unseen, unheard, unfed. The world forgets you the moment you stop echoing it, and that forgetting is the first real death. On the fourth night, I broke. I picked up the phone, thumb hovering over her name, over every name that once anchored me to noise. Then I remembered the fifth law, the collapse of systems through observation, and I turned the phone face down. The silence that followed was heavier than guilt, but sharper than pain. I realized that I didn't miss them. I missed the version of me that existed when they looked back. Identity, after all, is a mirror built from attention. Without it, you dissolve, unless you build a new reflection from within. That was the sixth law of awakening. If you can bear invisibility, you become untouchable. The hunger subsided slowly, replaced by something quieter, steadier, presence without audience. I watched dawn bleed through the blinds and felt no need to capture it. The listener didn't return because it no longer had to. I was beginning to listen on my own. Days passed, measured not by clocks but by the steadiness of my breath. The silence that once threatened to swallow me began to feel like structure, a framework inside which thought could settle and grow roots. When I walked through the city now, I moved slower, not from hesitation but from choice. People hurried around me, speaking into invisible channels, chasing reflections that never spoke back. I could sense their frequencies without absorbing them, like a diver who learns to let the current slide past instead of fighting it. Attention, I realized, wasn't something to defend. It was something to aim. When I directed it gently, even strangers shifted. A man stopped mid-argument. A child fell quiet. A dog turned its head as though hearing a whistle too low for others. Presence alters the field. It doesn't need to command it. The listener's first whisper returned, faint and approving. Exile was preparation. Inside, the old noise had settled into something almost musical. Guilt and fear still stirred, but they moved in rhythm now, no longer random. I began to understand that power isn't taken. It's reclaimed from the parts of you that gave it away. The world's systems still shouted, but their pitch no longer reached me. They sold distraction, but I had nothing left to trade. From that quiet came a different kind of strength, the ability to stand without demand, to act without performance. I learned the seventh law of awakening. Authority is the calm that remains when permission is no longer required. The face in the mirror no longer looked like a stranger. It looked like a witness. The calls had stopped long ago, yet in their absence I'd found the conversation I was meant to have all along. And for the first time, the silence didn't answer back. It listened. It began with small collisions. A colleague tried to bait me into an argument about things that didn't matter. I answered with a single sentence, and a look that ended the debate before it started. At the market, a man cut the line, shouting over everyone's patience. I met his eyes, not angry, just present. And he stepped aside as if nudged by an unseen hand. The difference wasn't dominance, it was density. Silence carried weight, and people could feel it. The world relies on tension to keep its rhythm alive. Noise feeding noise, reaction feeding reaction. When you refuse to join the exchange, the current stumbles. That stumble is where influence lives. The listener had once taught me to survive absence. Now I learned to wield it. Every confrontation became a test. Could I remain still enough to let the other person see themselves without my interference? Most couldn't. They filled the air with justification, defense, apology. It wasn't me they feared, it was reflection. Soon I began to notice how institutions behave the same way as individuals. The office, the media screens, even polite conversation, each demanded response. When I withheld it, the machinery sputtered, meetings shortened, arguments dissolved. I wasn't invisible anymore, I was undeniable in a way that required no words. That was the 8th law of awakening: presence unsettles what depends on distraction. But with it came danger. Power draws attention, and attention is the oldest form of hunger. People began to ask what had changed, some with curiosity, some with unease. I gave them nothing to grasp, only calm. The listener's silence echoed faintly, reminding me that mastery and isolation often travel the same path. I understood then that every awakening invites resistance, not from enemies but from the world's inertia. The challenge wasn't to fight it but to remain unchanged while walking through it. I left the city that night, not in exile this time, but in return, to the place where silence first began. The road back to the house was smaller than I remembered. Trees leaned over it like watchmen, their branches whispering in a language I almost recognized. Every mile felt like a memory replaying itself at half speed. When I reached the door, the lights were on. I stood there for a long time before knocking, long enough to hear my own heartbeat echo through the wood. The person who opened it was not the same woman who'd sent the message months ago, and I was not the same man who had answered with 87 calls. Time had carved both of us down to what was essential. Her eyes searched mine, neither of us spoke. In that silence I saw the truth I had missed before. Banishment had not been cruelty, it had been a boundary drawn in desperation. My obsession had been its own prison, hers and mine alike. The listener had led me here not for vengeance or proof but for understanding. I stepped inside. The air smelled of rain and dust. Every object was familiar yet slightly altered, as though the house had been breathing without me. We sat tea across from each other, the quiet stretching like a bridge. There were no apologies, only presence. Words would have ruined it. The silence between us did what language never could. It forgave. In that moment I felt the last echo of the listener fade completely, its task complete. It had been the architect of my descent. The voice that waited until I could listen without instruction. The 9th law of awakening unfolded itself softly. Healing begins where understanding replaces explanation. I told her, finally, that I didn't expect anything, that I only came to return the noise I'd taken with me. She nodded. The hum of the refrigerator filled the pause, steady and ordinary, and for the first time in months it sounded like peace. When I left, the door closed gently behind me, not as a barrier but as punctuation. Exile had ended, initiation had taken its place. Walking back through the quiet streets, I noticed how ordinary everything looked. Cars hissed over wet asphalt, someone laughed behind a half-closed window, a dog barked at nothing. Yet each sound seemed deliberate now, precise, like notes in a score I finally understood. The listener's lessons had condensed into something simple. Awareness was not a refuge from the world, it was participation without corruption. Power wasn't the ability to move others, it was the discipline to remain unshaken while among them. I felt no need to withdraw or proclaim. The silence that had once isolated me now moved with me, breathing through my words, shaping how I stood, how I listened. I realized that awakening doesn't end in enlightenment, it ends in usefulness. The 10th law revealed itself in a whisper that wasn't a voice but a knowing true stillness serves movement. Every step I took rippled outward, not because I intended it, but because intention itself had become transparent. People passed me, unaware, yet some slowed, turning their heads as if they'd heard something, a frequency just beyond hearing. I began to live by small gestures, holding doors open longer than expected, listening until people forgot they were performing, answering questions with questions that returned them to themselves. The strength I carried wasn't visible, but it steadied everything it touched. I called it silent leadership, the ability to anchor a room without claiming it. The listener's voice was gone, but its echo remained in the way I paused before speaking, the way I chose what not to say. The world hadn't changed, I had simply stopped resisting it. Clarity replaced conquest, and from it grew a quieter ambition to live so completely present that manipulation found no purchase. The 11th law of awakening formed itself out of breath. Influence is the byproduct of integrity. And for the first time the story no longer felt dangerous, it felt complete. Silence was no longer something to survive, it was home. I began to understand that the listener had never chosen me, it chooses everyone. Most people just drown out its call before they recognize the voice. It hides inside the pauses between our words, waiting for a single moment of stillness long enough to enter. Once it does, it doesn't bring comfort, it brings clarity, and clarity is heavier than pain. I had carried that weight long enough to know its purpose, not to isolate, but to temper. Every man must pass through a corridor of silence if he wants to meet his own strength unguarded. There are no shortcuts, no teachers who can speak the lesson for you. The listener speaks only in your own voice, stripped of justification. I thought of all the ways I had tried to fill that space, with noise, with need, with 87 calls, and I smiled. What I had feared as absence had been the beginning of substance. The 12th law of awakening settled into my chest. What you face without defense becomes your ally. So I began to speak again, but differently. Each word weighed more, carried further. People sensed it. Not awe, but recognition. It wasn't charisma. It was coherence. I told them what I had learned, that silence is not retreat, and listening is not weakness. That attention is the purest currency, and the way you spend it builds or breaks the world. Some nodded, some turned away, but the words were seeds, not arguments. I told them that the listener still waits for each of them, disguised as loneliness, disguised as failure, disguised as the moment they finally stop pretending. When you hear it, don't run. Sit. Let it strip you bare, and when the noise returns, as it always does, you'll carry silence inside it. You'll find that exile was never about being banned, it was about being called. And when you answer, the world itself begins to listen back. Every story ends where another begins, and this one was never about a message on a phone. It was about what happens when a man finally stops begging for an answer and starts hearing his own. The listener was only a shape the mind could understand. Silence itself was the teacher. Each law I had uncovered, presence, honesty, restraint, integrity, was nothing mystical. They were the mechanics of awareness, simple and devastating. I wanted to tell whoever might be listening that awakening doesn't lift you above the world, it roots you inside it. When you know how to listen, everything speaks, pavement underfoot, breath between words, the pause before yes or no. The same field that once enslaved attention becomes a mirror showing you exactly where you stand. You don't escape it, you navigate it. That's all mastery ever was. The 13th law came quietly. The listener becomes the world he listens to. If you followed me this far, if some part of this descent feels like your own, I want you to mark it, not for me but for yourself. Write the phrase, I hear the silence. Once to acknowledge that you found it, and again to remember that it never leaves. Let it be your symbol not of agreement but of presence, a reminder that attention is the first act of creation. You don't need to believe anything I've said, just test it. The next time the noise rises, the feed, the fight, the endless chase. Pause long enough to notice what waits beneath it. That quiet is not emptiness, it's potential. It's the place where everything true begins. Speak less, listen deeper. Let the world reveal what it sounds like without your fear in the way. That is the final threshold, and you have already stepped across it. The night after I spoke those words, the world felt wider, not brighter, not kinder, just real in a way I could finally bear. The hum of the city no longer pressed against my skull, it moved through me like wind through an open door. I understood that nothing had changed outside myself, yet everything had shifted in its relation to me. The listener had never been a presence waiting in the dark. It was attention, stripped of noise, given a name so I could recognize it. Once recognized, it didn't need to stay. Silence had taught me to see motion without fear, to meet sound without surrender. I no longer needed exile or calls unanswered to feel awake. Awareness had become ordinary, and ordinary was enough. That was the 14th and final law. Peace is what remains when understanding stops needing to speak. I walked until dawn, past shuttered shops and sleeping houses, the sky pale with the promise of another day I would not try to control. Somewhere a phone rang and was answered. Somewhere another went to voicemail. It didn't matter. Connection was no longer something to win or lose. It was something to inhabit. I thought of her, of every word left unspoken, and felt no urge to reach for the device in my pocket. Some stories don't end with reconciliation, they end with recognition. The silence I carried was not a weapon, not a secret, but a way of being, an agreement with the world to meet it as it is. As the sun lifted over the roofs, the city woke around me. For the first time, I didn't need to listen for the listener. The world itself was Lee. Standing back,